Hi, Mary. A very warm welcome to the A World of Difference podcast today.
So great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
It is great to have you. And I am excited for any of the listeners around the world. If you've not heard of Mary DeMuth before and you are a reader, you're going to love the things we're talking about today because Mary has written quite a few books. And we're going to talk about a new book that she's just released, as well as another one of my favorites out there. My first question for you is writers have different journeys that they are on. What got you into writing? And is your story typical or atypical, would you say, in that way?
I would say my story is doing all the hard things in order to get published. So I grew up loving words and graduated with an English degree. But it wasn't until my first child was born in the 90s that I just started feeling like I wanted to be published. And so I spent about a decade of just writing and writing unpublished words so that when I started to work toward traditional publishing with an agent and big publishing houses, all that, I'd already had about a decade of a lot of practice. And so I kind of am the crash test dummy of authors because I've tried everything and there was no romantic story about, being discovered one day. It was just a hard slog. But it's been also a joy of being able to just be able to write books. It's been such a blessing to be able to do so.
Well, I know that your books have blessed many, including me and others that I know that needed to read words that you put onto paper. And sometimes just the power of putting that down, it can give language to people who otherwise don't have it. As you have become a writer, and I know you also help others in the process of writing, do you have any advice for people out there who are struggling with the whole concept of becoming a writer from your perspective and your journey?
Well, thankfully, now is a really great time to be a writer. When I started in the early 2000s, you could either be self-published, which meant you'd have to shell out like $20,000, or you would traditionally publish. And that was my only option because I didn't have $20,000. So I had to traditionally publish.
Right.
But nowadays, you can upload your book to Amazon today and hold it in your hands in a couple days. So I would just say, just write. Pull the English teacher off your shoulder to get that first draft down. Invite her back into the conversation once the first draft is down so that you don't write drivel and that it's grammarly. I don't know how to say that.
We're going to make
The
up a
grammar
word.
is correct.
That's right.
Grammarly?
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, so that it's correct. And yeah, I think the main problem that most people have with writing is they make it into a big thing when really it's just laying words down on the page. Give yourself permission to do
Mm.
it and give yourself permission to do it poorly because it will be poor the first time you do it.
Ah, I love that advice. It's so good. And it really is consistent with, I feel like my podcast journey and so many podcast hosts that I know, and I know that you also have a podcast that you work with about prayer. And I think that the more voices we get out there, the better off we all are. And some of that perfectionism can get in the way in all kinds of areas of life. But one of the things that compelled me to start this podcast is I just want more voices in my life, speaking into my life, helping me understand how to make a difference, helping me understand how to live this human life in a better way and help others flourish at the same time as myself, right? And so, and I think women's voices in particular, or other, marginalized voices are ones I really crave hearing from. And so that advice is really spot on for this podcast. So all you listeners out there, take Mary's advice and just write. Yeah, so good. But I do want to dig into, and we're going to talk about you have like so many books, we could not cover them all, but we're going to cover a couple today. One is your newly released book, which we'll save for a little bit later. But I want to dig first into We Too, which is a book that really made a huge impact in a community that I came out of, which is the Southern Baptist Convention World Denomination. And so let's start with We Too. I'd love for you to share what inspired you to write this and what message you hope readers will take away from it.
Well, I think what inspired me was brokenness and pain and the church not doing, and when I say church, I'm talking about global C church of religious institutions. We saw the beginning of it with the Catholic Church and my friend Boz Chivijan back in the day, like back in the 2000s, said the Protestant church is worse. And I was like, no, it can't be. It totally is worse. So, um,
Yeah.
so it was born out of just this frustration that I believe faith communities are some of the best places to heal from trauma and abuse, or they should be. But
Yeah.
so often they become not only perpetrators of that kind of violence, but also secondary trauma of not believing, of blaming the victim. And oddly, for me, I uh, the church for me was a very healing place. I completely acknowledge that for many people that is not the truth and not the case.
Hmm.
But since I experienced it that way, I knew that there was a standard by which we could create for our churches, that they could become safe havens for people who are traumatized and hurting.
Mm. So beautiful. I was just at an abuse panel at a church here in the Bay Area where I live in Fremont. It's a church that's just wonderful and really having these hard conversations around abuse and trying to be preventative as well as, a healing space. But so I've spoken on a couple of their first panels. And then the one I went to this weekend is a survivor of the same church where I was spiritually abused as well.
Mm.
And it takes a while to tell your story. People are so brave when they do. And this particular survivor was so, so brave to share in this community because the church is still going. Right? There's still people everywhere. But one of the survivors that spoke, there were three different ones and three different stories, had a similar story to what you're saying, had come out of an abusive situation outside of the church, and it was the church where they healed. And it is so beautiful to hear those stories because it is how our bodies and our souls and our brains expect it to be. And yet, when it isn't, it can be the absolute worst thing that we didn't see coming. And so, as you wrote this book, I know that you had a lot of statistics in there. You did a lot of research for it. Talk about there's different types of abuse. You're largely dealing with sexual abuse in there, and I do want to dig into that in a minute. But what is the impact of some of that spiritual, emotional, psychological abuse that you encountered when you were writing the book?
Yeah, I actually wrote a big viral post about spiritual abuse because I had a friend that was going through it and it made me so mad. And so that I definitely just want to affirm that it's a complicated grief because it's all tied up with your faith. And so a lot of people will just deconstruct and walk away because they can't untether the two. And I totally understand how hard that can be. But I think it's
Mm-hmm.
worse when you are in a religious environment and you've suffered some sort of abuse, whether it be spiritual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, because it's convoluted and everything is couched in religious language. And so then the triggers
Mm-hmm.
are normal things you would hear when you walk back in. And so for a lot of my
Yeah.
friends who have experienced that in the church, walking into an environment where those words are being spoken that used to be used as weapons and certainly may not be meant that way by the leader of the church that you're walking into or the religious place you're walking into, but you can't help it. It's just, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's a more complicated healing journey than if like in my instance, in the sexual abuse, the boys who sexually abused me were Mormons. So in a sense, there was a faith element to it,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't until later when I met Jesus that I began to walk that healing journey and encountered people who really loved me through that.
Mm. Yeah, I remember just hearing that part or reading that in your book, and it gave me pause, and it's just so heartbreaking to know that you went through that as a child. And I know many people who've read that story that you wrote or have heard you share it are heartbroken with you. It's not okay for any child to have experienced that, and Yeah, I for one just want to let you know that I believe you, and I'm heartbroken that happened to you, and you're so brave to share it, to write about it, and to want to help others, and I just appreciate you for that.
Well, thank you. It's sharing. It's part of the healing journey, and no matter what kind of abuse you've been through, I often say to audiences, an untold story never heals. When we let it fester inside of us, it grows bigger like a monster, and we do need to find safe places to get it out. And my advice is, and we'll just go back to writing for a minute. My advice is, maybe you're so traumatized that you can't even think of one safe person. At least write
Mm,
it down. And then as you encounter people and you seem to find someone who loves you and is kind-hearted to you and is safe, just push the piece of paper across the table and let them read it. It's a really gentle way of beginning to tell your story, but you will not heal if you keep it inside.
it's so true. The cost of silence is born in our bodies and our souls, our brains, and it
Hmm.
comes out. It spills out like hot tea that's overflowing, and it's not something you can really keep a lid on. And so there's like a way to handle it, and there's a way to handle it, and I know that it's not an easy road ever in any circumstance, but that is really good advice to find a way to share it, even if it's a small step like writing it down. I really like that. The therapist that I worked with for a really long time in the beginning of the aftermath of coming out of recovering from abuse at our church. My husband and I went to a therapist that a lot of the survivors from our same abuser have gone to. You just say the name
Hmm.
of our former church, and then she knows. She's worked with a lot of us, does EMDR and brain spotting and
Hmm.
all the
Hmm.
things. It's helped a lot of us recover. But when we were with her, she said, maybe it's good just if you could write down, maybe even just write a letter. And so we wrote letters to our two abusers that we never sent, and it was so powerful because talking about it was a very huge part of our healing, and sharing our story, like Dr. Diane Lamberg says, as many times as it takes, and have those
Hmm.
people that will listen again and again as you peel the onion layers back. But also, there was something about writing it down that surprised both my husband and I at where the betrayal really was. And it wasn't clear how we could walk through the betrayal until we'd actually written those letters down. And
Hmm.
I do think that even if you're not a writer, there is something about that part of the brain that happens in the processing of it all that can be very, very helpful. Have you found that in writing you processed your story differently?
Yes, because I definitely told it a lot at first. When I was safe, I started telling my story at 15. The abuse happened at 5. So, and that's pretty rare. Most people wait until their late 20s to disclose an
Yeah.
abuse like that. So, I was a bit early on that. Uh, and that was very helpful. Lots of healing happened because of that. But it wasn't until I started writing for publication in the 2000s, early 2000s, that I had to confront the fear of it, because when you're writing it for a wide audience, you can't take it back. It's once it's out
Yeah.
there, it's out there.
Yeah.
And I recall the first time I wrote my story in one of my earlier books. It was called Building the Christian Family You Never Had. And so the
Mm,
point of that book is, how do you raise kids when you didn't have a very good example growing up? And so you're kind of starting from scratch. You're a pioneer. And
mhm.
and so in order for people to relate to me, I had to just in one chapter share my story. And I was terrified. And I was afraid that that the one of my alive parents would say that it didn't happen and withdraw their love from me. And
Aw.
my editor said, when we were all through the editorial process, and I told him, listen, I don't want this to be punitive. I don't want it to sound like I'm the victim and they're I don't want to be finger pointing. I just want to plainly tell the story. And after we'd gone
Yeah.
through all the edits and did all of that, he said, you need to tell that person that you wrote that chapter. And I had all those fears, and I sent that
Mm.
chapter to them, and everything that I feared came true. It
Oh,
didn't
no.
happen, they said, and I'm going to withdraw my love from you. And it
Oh,
was,
no.
what was cool about it, this sounds like a sad story, but it's actually a really happy story. So I had the worst thing that could happen to me happen, and I was still standing. And I
Wow.
realized that that person had been like 12 feet tall. And when they did the very thing I thought that they shouldn't do, but they did anyway, they shrunk in my mind to a normal human
Mm,
being size. And that
mm.
one chapter then gave me the courage to go ahead and write an entire book with my story, which is Thin Places, a memoir. So it has that whole story in there. And then those then became the foundations of the next. And so you go from fear to fear to fear, but you also go from
Yeah.
strength to strength to strength.
Oh man, that is so powerful. And I'm sure that other people have had various versions that can relate to what you're saying. It's that thing you're most afraid of, that if you actually just are brave enough to face it and name the fear and just go forward anyway, um, even if you face everything you thought, it catapults you into something so much bigger. Now you have this huge field to run and play in and be brave. I had a similar experience in the sense that, in my particular story, when my husband and I didn't sign the NDAs tied to severance because we felt that that was abusive in itself to ask someone to not share their story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, once that happened, and then I began to be slandered by to the lead and executive pastor, to the staff, 2 different weeks in a row with
Mm-hmm.
different false narratives. They had to keep switching around. It was like, wow, you've publicly ruined my reputation.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is once they did that, it's like, well, what am I, if I'm afraid of speaking out because of my reputation? Well, you've already that was kind of not a very good chess move, because actually now I literally don't, what am I going to do? Right. I mean, you've literally, I'm called Jezebel. I'm called evil. They have prayer meetings that say, pray, Lori's being evil or whatever. And most people that have left or either are still there and still believe me don't fall for it. And so it's kind of like, well, you've really done the worst thing that could happen. So now I might as well speak to the press, because most people I know and have known throughout my life for decades of, I'm not a perfect person, but my husband and I have good reputations because we've tried our best to care for people and learn from our mistakes and that kind of thing, do repair when necessary. And so those people have all been like, yeah, we believe you. It was just the people inside. And I think that in abuse cases, there is always that fear that you won't be believed and that people will withdraw. And that's a pretty common trauma response. And so I recognize that. And I'm sure other people listening do too. Your book, We Too, though, it delves into the topic of, sexual abuse within the church. And so I'm curious to know, what kind of impact do you hope your book will have on places like the Southern Baptist Convention, other denominations as well that are facing this, or specific churches and individuals?
Well, I learned something about myself when I wrote that book, and I definitely had a prayer team praying for me through the release of that book, because I knew that bad things were going to happen to me if I released that book. So there
Mm-hmm.
was going to be backlash and all of that. I learned that I am not good at politics. So
Mm,
I do attend a church that is loosely affiliated with Southern Baptist. And so because of the book, I was invited to come on the floor of the Southern Baptist Convention and pray, and also do presentations and things like that throughout the conference. I had to ask my church to send me as a messenger. They hadn't sent someone since like 1985. So it was definitely, that's how loosely affiliated they are.
yeah.
And so I didn't grow up in the church. I'm from the North. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not a Southern Baptist in my mind. And the
Yeah.
fact that I go to an SBC church is really like weird, because it doesn't feel like one. Anyway, all that to say, I didn't
Right.
feel like it was my job to reform the SBC, but I did have a very public role in it for a period of time during that book when it was released. And so there was a lot of being accused of being woke. I don't even know what that means. It's so silly, but
Right.
whatever. And,
Yeah.
just like, we're there for whatever reason, and I don't understand this at all, and maybe you can help me, because maybe you know more about the SBC than I do, but there's a very strong concern about the liberal drift. And so, like, somehow caring for people who have been sexually abused is liberal. I just think it's Christ-like. But
Mm,
that's
mm-hmm.
the one question I kept coming back when I would get, in trouble or whatever, or yelled at or whatever. I would just be like, okay, let's just get back to looking at the life of Jesus. And if someone, and we've seen it in scripture, people who had been abused, people who had been harmed, when they came to him, how did he respond? Now let's just choose to respond that way too. We err on the side of belief. We listen. We dignify the person. We hurt on behalf of the sin that's been perpetrated against them. We stand for justice. These are all things that Jesus did. And I guess if that's liberal, then Jesus is liberal. But it was
Yeah.
just the most ridiculous thing. And
Mm-hmm.
and so, yeah, I guess I learned I had to take a 3-month sabbatical after the book released because I couldn't carry anymore. And
Yeah.
mostly it wasn't the stories, although that was hard. I carried a lot of stories, and that I won't diminish that. But what
Right.
was harder was all the politics involved in
Yeah.
trying to change a system. I realize I'm
Mm-hmm.
not the girl to do that. I just want to talk about healing and providing safe
Yeah.
places for people.
Oof. Yeah, it's a lot to expect any survivor to fix any system, even their
Mm-hmm.
own situation, which
Mm-hmm.
often is the case, right? We don't center the survivor, the victim survivor, and their needs. We, do things like use forgiveness as a weapon or
Mm-hmm.
monitor their forgiveness status and our own opinions of what that
Ugh.
should look like and all that kind of stuff. And so it's just unreasonable, but it's absolutely unfathomable that somebody who just wrote a book would be asked to be involved in that and then be called names in the process. But it's also not shocking. I think that, even Dr. Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer, who've been on the show a couple times, and, I mean, Scott especially is like, I'm not trying to, I don't want to fix this. I don't want to be a church consultant, right? I'm just writing, right? I'm an
Mm-hmm.
academic. It is a lot to ask. And I think that one of the things that is so difficult about these situations is that um, the system is doing what it was designed to do and trying to fix it from the inside. Many of us have come to the conclusion that it's not actually possible. I do have a lot of respect and admiration and allow for all of the perspectives that are inside trying to make a difference, because I think it takes a lot out of people to
Mm-hmm.
get in there for that long and be that patient. And I think that's really admirable. But, for me and others, we've chosen to be outside, maybe in a sense of like if there's somebody inside experiencing spousal abuse, that it's really hard for them to stay in that marriage and fix that marriage. They really need to get to safety. And so some of us
Yeah.
have come to that conclusion and used that metaphor with this. You use a metaphor. I don't know if you remember it in your book. And I actually loved it so much. But if you remember your poop brownies
Oh, yeah.
metaphor, I'd love for you to explain this and how it helps us address abuse.
Yeah, it's that there was that scene in the movie where she serves the poop pie, which it's a similar metaphor, obviously. But I think what I've learned is we tend to want I don't know how to explain it necessarily, but if a church is perfect in every way, which there's no such thing, but there's a
Right.
religious system that's perfect in every way, except they are harboring people who are harming people, whether that be sexually or leadership wise or whatever. It's offering a poop brownie. So you wouldn't want to take that, knowing that there was something in there that really stunk.
Mhm.
And even though there's a lot of chocolatey goodness masking the taste, I believe we're called to purity and justice and erring on the side of helping the one who is victimized. But as you mentioned before, our church systems, at least in the United States, and you and I have both lived overseas, we've both been missionaries
Right.
overseas.
Mhm.
We have the advantage of coming back into the American church system with better eyes. And the
Yeah.
American church system is very much built on celebrity. It's very much built on fame and platform. And I'm in the writing industry. It's all built on platform. And that system has to protect itself because ultimately that system is about making money. And in
Mhm.
order to protect money and all the jobs underneath, then you have to silence anyone that points out the poop. And
Yeah.
because you have to protect the institution at any cost. And the institution becomes more important than shepherding your people. And if that happens, then something is wrong with the church.
Mm, so true. I really love the metaphor. One, because it's funny, and we always need a little bit of humor in these situations.
Yes, definitely.
It helps us with our, processing our trauma in different ways. But also, it's so clear because I think a lot of what, and if you've had a chance to read Pivot, which is the follow up to A Church Called Tove that Scott and Laura just wrote, they use like a tree metaphor in there a lot. So like, what are the roots like? What is the fruit like? And sometimes trees will produce both good and bad fruit. Like not every tree always produces these perfectly juicy peaches every time, right? And that can be so confusing. But the reality is you don't want to eat a rotten fruit. No, nobody wants that, even no matter how it looks on the outside. And the same with poop brownies. And I think that sometimes people decide to stay in an abusive system or an abusive marriage because of that cycle of abuse that is common in all the situations. It's not all bad, or you would never stay. If
Right.
if the husband wasn't love bombing the wife, she wouldn't
Right.
stay. Or they didn't have these trauma bonds or whatever, these things that happen in a church situation. It can be like the free mugs, the free t-shirts, the endorphins that get created from these contagious joy values of partying, and the way that your brain gets really tied to this community and won't let it go no matter how much bad is there. And that's why the poop brownies is such a perfect metaphor. When you were encountering research for this book, or even in the aftermath as you have spoken, do you have any words of knowledge or wisdom in your experience of what you've learned to speak to that person now that might be wondering, should I stay or should I go in a situation like that?
It's such a difficult decision, and I just want to verify that. It's not as simple as saying, well, you're being hurt, so leave. We know
Right.
that in cycles of abuse. We understand that, particularly in an abusive marriage, very clear. It's not as simple. There's a lot of economic realities as well, especially in the
Yeah.
marital sphere. But in terms of church, my husband and I are working through those questions as well. You get to a point of, what's the straw that breaks the camel's back?
Yeah.
and I have found that I was in an abusive situation a couple years ago, and it wasn't a church related one, but it will be a good example for this. So I was in it, and I kept having these body responses, like these trauma body responses that I only had felt from other things that were what I thought was much worse, like sexual abuse and whatever. So I was
Yeah.
having these, I was continually in this state of anxiety, and I was having these traumatic body experiences. But my mind was like, oh, I should stay because this will be good for me, or I'm going to learn something, or this is what you have to do to pay your dues, just all those kinds of things that I was thinking. And it wasn't until I made that leap, and I did process with very safe friends outside of that situation. But once I left, now I see so much more clearly the whole rottenness of the whole thing. And God has been so gracious to me to like show them to me. Like, you made
Wow.
the right decision. It was the right thing to do. Look at this bad thing that's happening. And so, because I knew I had tried, and this is maybe what you're getting at, I had tried from within that broken system to repair it. And every
Yeah.
single time I tried, I was shamed. I was pushed against. My body would have a reaction. And no matter how hard I tried to change this unchangeable system, they would push back. And so the only thing that I could do is leave. And I think that's one of the straws that breaks the camel's back is, if you've tried 5 times,
Yeah.
what has been the response each of those 5 times? Has it always been pushing back? Have you had a body reaction? If that's the case, it's time to go.
Yeah. Good advice. I hear a lot of people saying, well, God hasn't released me. I need to pray about it, or things like that. And I'm not saying that that's never the wrong response. But by and large, I don't believe God is abusive, or God wants us to stay in systems that abuse us and cause our bodies to react, or silence us, or don't let us challenge. Scott McKnight would say, if a leader can't be questioned, that's a sign of a tyrannical leader, right? That's not a good thing. And you need to, if your leader can never be questioned, or your system can't be questioned, that's a toxic situation and abusive in many cases. And so if power is being abused, probably there's other abuses going on too in different ways. And so sometimes, like, where there's smoke, there's fire. And so
Right.
I agree. Like, we get the frog being boiled situation because that's hard to navigate.
Definitely.
Well, one last question about this book, and then I want to move on to other parts of your writing and your life. But what are some common misconceptions or challenges you think survivors of sexual abuse in particular probably face when they're trying to find healing and support within a religious context, especially?
I think one is that these religious systems, on the most part, are not trauma informed. And so they're just not going to get it. And I think we hope that they are, or we expect that they are, because they're supposed to have, the metaphor used throughout the Bible is shepherd and sheep. And shepherds are supposed to take care of sheep. Of course, we see, I believe it's in Ezekiel 30, that's either 32 or 34, where there's this damnation against shepherds who didn't take care of the sheep and ate the sheep. So there is definitely things written about bad shepherds in the Bible. And so I think that's part of the problem, is just this kind of wide-eyed, this is supposed to be a safe place, and kind of walking in expecting it, which I don't blame anyone. I expected that too. But unfortunately, there's just not a lot of training going in for churches about this. I wish that there was more. And then I think the other thing is just, we live in our culture, and so this may not be a problem with the church per se, but in our culture, we live in an instantaneous culture. And we want to be able to snap our fingers and tell our story and be healed in the same moment. And trauma is, it may have taken 1 minute for that trauma to happen to you. It may not even taken 10 minutes of your life. It takes a lifetime to untangle. That's unfair, and I affirm that it is completely unfair. Why do I have to spend my whole life with what happened in a short period of time? But that's just how it works, and that's our physiology. And so if we walk into it, which I've done, and that's why I said this, in my 20s, I was prayed for 4 years during college. And so I went like this. I was like, okay, I'm done. I have been prayed for, and I had a lot of healing. Don't get me wrong. Lots of great things happened, but I assumed it was over. And then when I got married, things arose. And when I started having children, things arose. And these layers of trauma kept coming off. And I was mad. I was like, no, I did the work. I prayed. I told my story. I did it. And the Lord so gently was like, there's another layer. And this is a long-term obedience, not a quick one and done. Although I wish it were.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I don't think I've met a survivor of any type of abuse yet that doesn't want a trapdoor every single day out of this nightmare, and also wasn't surprised by how long it takes to find healing. And it comes in stages, and it goes through cycles, like grief cycles, and comes back and, surprises you, and you carry it in your body, whether it was a physical or sexual abuse or not, and so it is so difficult. And I hope that anybody listening, if you have walked through any type of abuse or trauma, that you'll just, be patient with yourself, because it does take time, and it takes as long as it takes, as a lot of us say. I know that you spent some time overseas, and some of that was a mixed bag. But if you had anything that you could say about that experience that gave you a whole new perspective on life. A lot of people who go overseas come back and say, wow, I just don't see the world in the same way. Did you have any experience like that for you that you could point to?
Yes. And I think it was just, I needed to be divorced from my home culture and be completely discombobulated in another culture. In my case, it was France, in order to kind of shake me out of my lethargy of what does a what does a Christian community look like? And, trying to establish one in another country, you try to look at what's more universal and what is the Bible saying when it's the second chapter of Acts and we're getting together and we're breaking bread and meeting each other's needs. And then you compare that to a mega church and you're like, what is this? How do these two things
Yeah.
connect? um,
Yeah.
I think that's the thing that really helped me. I also think that I became less black and white. Um,
Mm.
I still love the Bible. I affirm it very much. I love it, but there wasn't a lot of room for nuance before, and now there's a lot
Mm.
of room for the fact that everyone's different. Everyone has a different story, and I don't have to agree with someone to bear their burden, if that makes sense.
Mm. So good. Yeah. I think so many of us who read scriptures of various kinds and live overseas and learn other languages start to see them in a new way. In some ways that they reject the scriptures altogether, depending on which ones, they read and which ones are dear to them. And other times it becomes richer and more meaningful. And so I know that you, like you said, you continue to love the Bible, and you've written a new book that I want to talk a little bit about. Um, and there's different ways to read the Bible. And I know that somebody who is a writer, and you've actually got a degree in English, I think, right? And
Mm-hmm.
there's so much different. A lot of things that people don't talk about is that the Bible has different genres, right? So there's
Mm-hmm.
letters, there's poetry, there's story. And so as you were kind of working on this book, what parts of that spoke to you? And is there anything you want to say to our listeners about what you discovered about the Bible as you were writing this book?
Well, as a storyteller, and so when I started writing, I was only writing fiction. So I am definitely a storyteller. So I am coming to the Bible with that lens. And a couple of years ago, I just felt like I didn't have the whole Bible in my head. Like, what's the story? And so I
Mm,
started reading it rapidly, which is what this book, it's called the 90-Day Bible Reading Challenge. Read the whole Bible, change your whole life. So this is hard. This is 90 days of reading everything. But what I learned and what it helped me do was I finally grasped the whole story from beginning to end, what the fall of humankind and the great redemptive journey that we are on and God is on, and what that story arc looks like, where I am in the middle of the story. And so that's really why I embrace this practice. This isn't something you're going to do every 3 months or anything like that. It may just be a once in a lifetime thing that you do, but there's so much richness in having all of that squished together so that you can kind of grasp the whole narrative of scripture.
Yeah, it's so impactful just to do it. It's almost like a crash course, I guess, in the Bible.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And yeah, you don't have time in between to forget what you just saw. Like if you're
Hmm.
watching a show on Netflix and they've had a delay because of the
Yes.
writer's strike and your new season doesn't come out until
Like,
2 years,
what
you're
was
like, I have to rewatch.
happening?
Yeah, I need to
Yeah.
rewatch the last season.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, do it all at once. Yeah, it's a really it's a interesting way to do it in the sense that you're trying to find the whole picture. I
Hmm.
know sometimes people come at the Bible and um, they get a little confused in different parts, and obviously there's parts where they are shocking
Hmm.
or seem really hard to even interpret or hold. And so some of our listeners may be in that place right now. Have you had experiences like that? And if you have or haven't, what is your advice as somebody who's read the Bible, I guess, in French and then in English, and any perspective on that?
I haven't read it in French. I should. That would be really lovely. Um, just to be honest, I think you're always going. There's any scripture, any book that's holy, you're going to have questions. Any book that you read, you're going to have questions. And so I just want to affirm that that's super normal, and that it's okay to hold that intention. There are still some things that I hold in tension that I don't have the answer to. But I know the nature of God is to love me and care for me and rescue me, heal me. And so I keep that in the back of my mind while I am, messing with something that doesn't make sense to me. Um, it's just normal. And if we don't allow for questions, and we don't allow for nuance, and we don't allow for gray areas, and we don't allow for the fact that, it's a giant book and there's a lot in there, like you said, I think sometimes we, though, will just throw the baby out with the bathwater. We might have like 10 questions about 10 things that happen in the Bible, but there's, thousands of other things, the wisdom of the Proverbs, the beauty of the life of Jesus, that we might miss if we throw out the things that are conundrums for us.
Yeah. I remember back when I was getting my master's degree, when I was in seminary, and there were certain seminary books that we would read, and I would be like, I just really adamantly disagree with this author and the way they say this or whatever in one of my classes. And it's like, but I really love this other part. And I think that it's like, I've had that posture with books that I read too. I don't think I've ever read a book that there's not a part of it that it's like, oh, I would say that
Sure.
differently, or, you question that.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm an Enneagram 8. We just challenge. That's what we like to do. So
I'm married to one of those.
oh, are you? Yeah,
Yes.
it's like,
I'm not
why do you
that,
have
but
so many
that's my
questions?
husband. So many
Yeah.
questions. I just call him the
Yeah.
questioner all the time. Like,
Yeah. We're good investigators.
Yeah.
Actually, I think that's a whole different Enneagram, the investigator. But anyway, we like to ask questions.
Yeah.
So systems that don't allow it are not, places we
No,
want
that's
to
not
be.
going to work.
But right, exactly. But at the same time, like, you probably as an author, like, look back at some of your earlier books and think, well, at this point in my life, I might even write that differently or word that differently.
Mhm.
And I think that that's important to recognize. The Bible is these ancient scriptures written by a lot of different people over a lot of
Mhm.
years with a whole different ancient way of living and that kind of thing. So I think we need to keep that in mind as we read it. But does it have something to say to us today? I believe it does. And I do want to keep in mind that there are different genres of what's written. Not everything is prescriptive.
Right.
Sometimes it's just descriptive. And
Mhm.
understanding the difference between descriptive and prescriptive is really important, I think, when
Huge.
reading the Bible.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
because when you look at the story of Bathsheba, for instance, it's not
Yes.
saying that if you're a king, you should look at a lady and then rape her, and kill a
Yeah.
husband.
Please don't.
Like, that's not, it's
Yeah.
descriptive, not prescriptive. And
Mhm.
she is never once blamed. And if you read that story plainly and you
Yeah.
divorce all the bad theology that you've gotten from the past or what you've heard from the pulpit, never once does the Bible blame her. She is listed in the genealogy as Uriah's wife. Like, she's
Yeah.
definitely not blamed. And yet we hear from, pastors that she was being all slinky on the roof. Well, that's never mentioned in the scripture. And so that's why we have to look at the difference between descriptive and prescriptive, and even just look at the plain reading of the text.
Yeah. I mean, even the part of like Nathan has a few choice words for David about everything he did wrong that he needed to repent of. There's nothing about Bathsheba having to repent of, breaking purity culture rules by
Yeah.
taking a freaking bath. And apparently taking a bath there was like normal. Like she wasn't doing
That's
anything
what you
different.
do.
And he
Yeah,
was
you just
just,
bathe.
it's like,
Yeah.
why were you looking? You're a creep,
Yeah.
So,
Weirdo.
yes.
Yeah.
What is wrong with
Creeper.
you? Yeah, exactly. So yes, not prescriptive, absolutely. And also understanding, even though the word abuse isn't used, because that was probably not a word they even, understood the way that we do now. Definitely the implications are there that, something had been done wrong by the king, abuse his power. And Nathan was kind of had a few choice words for the king about that. So good illustration of that whole point. Well, it's been lovely to have you today. I want people to be able to find you and your writing. So if we have people that are interested in learning how to write, also interested in your books, how do they find you and learn more from you?
So you can find me at Mary DeMuth and all the social platforms. And then my website is marydemuth.com. If you happen to want to do a 90-day Bible reading challenge, we're going to do it together in community in January. So you can go to marydemuth.com/Bible. And then if you want to
Nice.
know about writing, it's Mary DeMuth Literary. That's my literary agency.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your words today, for all your writing. What a gift it is to us, and also for helping authors out there to have their voice to be brought into the world. We need more voices for sure, more diverse voices, more voices from women and people of color. It would be great to hear from you. And so get in touch with Mary and learn more from her. She's definitely put in the work and knows a few things after all her experience of what she's walked through. So thanks for being on the show today. We're also going to have you with our supporters in the Difference Maker community. I'm going to ask you another question there. But for this interview, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you.
So good to be here. Thank you.